What follows is drawn from a mix of county health records, the private journal of a nurse who worked there for less than 4 months, and the oral accounts of a handful of families in the region who still, to this day, refuse to let their children hike past the old ridge road after dark. Some of it can be verified. Much of it cannot. That, in the end, may be the most disturbing part of the whole affair. High in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, in a hollow so narrow the sun only reached the valley floor for a few hours a day, there once stood a tuberculosis sanatorium known locally as Ashford Ridge. It was built in 1911, funded partly by the state and partly by a coalition of coal companies eager to have somewhere to send workers whose lungs had given out from years underground. By the time this story begins, in the early months of 1928, Ashford Ridge had grown into a sprawling complex of 6 wards, a central administration building, a small chapel, and a separate structure everyone on staff simply called the Annex. A long, low building set apart from the others by nearly 200 yards of pine forest, connected to the main hospital only by a covered wooden walkway that had, by 1928, already begun to rot in places. Officially, the Annex didn't exist. It appeared on no floor plan filed with the state health department. It received no separate budget line. When new staff asked about it, they were told, in the flat, practiced tone of people repeating something they'd been instructed to say, that it was simply storage and not somewhere you need to go. The woman whose journal survives to tell most of this story was a 26-year-old nurse named Cora Whitfield, who arrived at Ashford Ridge in January of 1928 with 2 years of nursing experience and a letter of recommendation from a hospital in Roanoke. Cora was practical, unsentimental by nature, and not, by her own account, someone prone to imagination or superstition, which is precisely why the hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Reginald Voss, chose to keep detailed records of what she reported, even as he quietly worked to discredit her afterward. Cora's early journal entries describe Ashford Ridge as an unremarkable, if grim, place to work. Tuberculosis patients arrived thin and coughing, some improved with rest and mountain air the way the treatment of the era promised, and many others did not. The wards were orderly. The staff, mostly local women supplemented by a handful of doctors from Richmond and Charlottesville, worked long hours in a routine that, however sad, was at least predictable. The predictability broke in her 6th week, on a bitterly cold night in late February, when Cora was asked by the head matron, a stern, tightly wound woman named Agnes Pruitt, to deliver a tray of supplies to the Annex patients. Cora wrote that she'd assumed this was simply the storage building being referred to loosely, and thought little of it until she followed the covered walkway through the pines and arrived at a building with barred windows, a locked outer door requiring a key Agnes kept on a separate ring from the rest of the hospital's keys, and, unmistakably, patients inside. There were, according to Cora's count that first night, 11 beds occupied in the Annex ward. The patients were unusually quiet, not sedated exactly, Cora clarified in her journal, since she'd seen sedated patients before and this was different, more like the patients simply had very little left in them to express. Several didn't respond when spoken to at all. One elderly man tracked her across the room with his eyes but never turned his head. A young woman, who Cora guessed to be no older than 19, sat upright in bed with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall, and repeated the same 3 words softly, on a loop, the entire 20 minutes Cora was in the room. Not yet finished. Not yet finished. Not yet finished. When Cora asked Agnes the following morning about the Annex patients, their diagnoses, their charts, why they were kept separate from the main tuberculosis wards, Agnes's answer, recorded word for word in Cora's journal, was this: "Those aren't your patients to worry about, dear. Dr. Voss handles the Annex personally. You just deliver what you're told to deliver, and you don't linger." Cora, being the practical sort, might have left it at that if not for what happened 3 nights later, when she was asked to deliver supplies to the Annex again and discovered that the count of occupied beds had changed. Not increased or decreased through ordinary admission or discharge, the way a hospital ward naturally shifts, but rearranged. The elderly man who had tracked her with his eyes was gone entirely, his bed stripped and empty. In his place, 2 beds down, lay a man Cora didn't recognize, easily in his 60s, with the same unervingly still quality to his stare. When she checked the admission ledger kept just inside the annex door, a book she wasn't technically permitted to read, but did anyway while Agnes was occupied elsewhere, she found no record at all of a new admission. The ledger, in fact, contained almost nothing. Patient numbers, not names. Dates that didn't correspond to any check-in or check-out. And in the margin beside several entries, in a doctor's cramped handwriting she'd come to recognize as Dr. Voss's, a single recurring notation, source confirmed. Proceeding. Cora didn't know what to make of it, and being new enough to the hospital that she valued her position, chose not to press the matter directly with Dr. Voss. Instead, she began, almost as a private hobby, to keep closer track of the annex patients each time she was sent there, writing down descriptions, approximate ages, any distinguishing features. In a section of her journal she titled simply, The 11, since the bed count, whatever else changed, seemed to hold steady at 11 occupied beds on almost every visit. Over the following 6 weeks, Cora's journal documents a pattern that clearly troubled her more with each entry. Patients in the annex changed. Not through death. She never once witnessed or was informed of a death among them, which was itself strange in a tuberculosis sanatorium where death among the general patient population was a near-weekly occurrence, formally logged and mourned with at least a token church service. Annex patients simply appeared and disappeared between her visits, sometimes within the same week, with no ledger entry, no transfer paperwork, no explanation offered by Agnes beyond the same clipped instruction to deliver the supplies and not linger. More unsettling still, Cora began to notice that several of the new patients bore a resemblance, not identical, but close enough to trouble her, to townspeople she recognized from trips into the nearest village, Harlow's Gap, population perhaps 400. A woman she was fairly certain she'd seen selling eggs at the general store. A boy who looked remarkably like the son of the man who delivered coal to the hospital's boiler room. She never mentioned this suspicion to anyone at the hospital, worried it would sound like the kind of overactive imagination Dr. Voss and Agnes clearly assumed nurses were prone to, but she wrote it down carefully each time, dating every entry. The turning point in Cora's account, the event that led, eventually, to her leaving Ashford Ridge entirely and, according to hospital records, being dismissed for conduct unbecoming and the spreading of unfounded rumors, came on the night of April 3, 1928. She had been sent, as usual, to deliver a supply tray to the annex, but arrived to find the outer door already unlocked and slightly ajar, which had never happened before. Inside, the ward was dim, lit only by 2 oil lamps rather than the usual 4, and entirely silent. No coughing, no murmuring, none of the low ambient sound 11 occupied beds should produce even from patients as unresponsive as these. Cora counted the beds. All 11 were occupied, forms clearly visible beneath the blankets. But as she moved closer to check on the nearest patient, the young woman who used to whisper about being not yet finished, Cora realized the shape beneath the blanket wasn't moving at all, not with breath, not with the small involuntary shifts even the stillest patient makes. She pulled back the blanket and found, in her own words written that same night in trembling handwriting quite unlike her usually neat entries, not a woman. Not anything I have a word for. Something shaped like the idea of a person, the way a child might draw one from memory rather than from looking, the proportions almost right, but wrong in a way I could feel more than see. It did not have proper hands. It did not have a proper face, though there were indentations where a face ought to be. And it was warm, God help me, it was warm to the touch like something recently alive, though nothing about it looked as though it had ever been. Cora's journal entry becomes fragmented after this point, less coherent, clearly written in a state of significant distress. She describes hearing footsteps in the corridor and, in a panic, pulling the blanket back over the form and retreating toward the door, only to find Dr. Voss himself standing in the doorway, blocking her exit, with an expression she described as, not angry, which frightened me more than anger would have. He looked disappointed. The way you look at a child who has found something they weren't supposed to find, and now you have to decide what to do about it. What Dr. Voss told her that night, according to the journal, was this: the annex existed to study a condition beyond the scope of ordinary medicine, one that Voss claimed to have first encountered years earlier during his own medical training, involving cases where the boundary between the living and something he called the borrowed shape grew thin. He spoke, Cora wrote, with the calm, practiced confidence of a man who had explained this many times before to people who then never spoke of it again. He told her that the 11 beds were never truly empty, that what occupied them arrived already knowing how to look mostly right, but needed time and study and proximity to real patients to finish the shape correctly. He told her, and this is the line Cora underlined 3 times in her journal, hard enough to tear slightly through the page, "They are practicing at being people, Nurse Whitfield. My job, and now yours, is simply to make sure they get better at it somewhere we can watch." Cora was, understandably, unable to process this claim as anything other than the ravings of a man who had perhaps spent too many years isolated in a mountain sanatorium surrounded by death. She demanded to leave. Dr. Voss, according to her account, let her go without resistance, telling her only that she was, of course, free to tell anyone she liked, since no one who hasn't seen it themselves will ever believe you, and everyone who has seen it already works here. Cora left Ashford Ridge 2 days later, officially dismissed, and returned to Roanoke, where she attempted, unsuccessfully, to interest a newspaper reporter and, later, a state health inspector in what she'd witnessed. The health inspector's file, which survives in fragmentary form in the state archives, notes only that Ashford Ridge was found to be operating within acceptable standards upon a follow-up visit in May of 1928, and makes no mention of any annex building at all, despite Cora's insistence that the inspector be shown it specifically. Whether the building was somehow concealed from the inspection, deliberately omitted by whoever compiled the inspector's paperwork, or simply not investigated with any real diligence, remains impossible to determine from the surviving record. Ashford Ridge Sanatorium continued operating for another 11 years, finally closing in 1939 as tuberculosis treatment shifted toward newer methods and the Mountain Air Sanatorium model fell out of favor nationally. Dr. Reginald Voss's name appears in state medical board records until 1936, after which it simply stops, with no death certificate, retirement notice, or transfer of practice on file anywhere researchers have since been able to locate. Agnes Pruitt's trail disappears even earlier, in 1931, with a final entry in the hospital's payroll ledger and nothing afterward. The buildings themselves stood empty and slowly decaying for decades, gradually reclaimed by the surrounding forest, until a fire of undetermined origin destroyed most of the main hospital structure in 1967. The annex building, oddly, was the one structure the fire never reached, separated as it was by the stretch of pine forest and the long-collapsed wooden walkway, and its foundation, along with a portion of one brick wall, reportedly still stands today, though the site is on private land now and not open to casual visitors. Cora Whitfield's journal survived because she gave it, along with a written statement, to her younger sister before she herself passed away in 1974, asking that it not be shared publicly during her lifetime. It was her sister's grandson, going through family belongings decades later, who eventually allowed portions of it to be reviewed by a regional historian researching the sanatorium's history, though he has, so far, declined to make the full journal publicly available, citing, in his own words, things in there I'd rather not be responsible for putting into the world. What remains of the story beyond Cora's account is fragmentary and secondhand, but consistent enough across separate sources to be worth noting. Several elderly residents of Harlow's Gap, interviewed decades later by the same regional historian, independently recalled family stories about relatives who had, at some point in the late 1920s, gone strange after a stay at Ashford Ridge, returning home changed in small, hard-to-articulate ways, speaking a little too slowly, sitting a little too still, as though relearning something the rest of their family had never had to learn in the first place. None of these accounts can be verified against any hospital record, since Ashford Ridge's surviving paperwork, what little of it exists, contains almost no complete list of patient admissions for the annex specifically, only that recurring, unexplained ledger notation Cora had glimpsed. Source confirmed. Proceeding. One final detail deserves mention, though it comes from the least verifiable source in this entire account. A brief, unsigned letter tucked inside the back cover of Cora's journal, in handwriting that does not match her own, dated several years after she left Ashford Ridge, with no return address. The letter is short and reads in its entirety. You were right to leave when you did. The 11 beds were never about the 11. They were about the 12th bed, the one we never let visitors see, and what it was waiting to become once it finally got the shape right. I hope, wherever you are, you never have reason to learn what became of it. No further explanation accompanies the letter. Cora, according to her sister's later recollection, never spoke about who might have sent it, and the journal entries end, abruptly, not long after. Today, hikers occasionally stumble across the remaining foundation stones of the old annex while exploring the ridge, usually without knowing what they found. Locals who do know the history tend to describe the same small, quiet piece of advice passed down through families in Harlow's Gap for nearly a century now. If you find yourself near that foundation as the light starts to fail, don't stay to look around. And if you ever come across an old iron bed frame half buried in the pine needles up there, still upright somehow after all these decades, don't lie down in it even for a photograph.